Right, we'll just assume that anybody else coming along will find their way somehow to here. So, right, good evening, and welcome to the University of Glasgow and tonight's Stevenson Trust for Citizenship lecture. I'm Christopher Carman. I'm the Stevenson Professor of Citizenship here at the university. The Stevenson Trust was founded in 1921 with a generous gift to the university by Sir Daniel Stevenson. Sir Daniel was a Glasgow businessman, philanthropist, Lord Provost, and Chancellor of this fine institution. In the aftermath of the Great War, he was animated by the conviction that an informed citizenry is the foundation of democracy. And it is in that spirit that the Trust has tried to operate ever since, bridging the gap between expert analysis and public understanding. And so in that spirit this evening, I can welcome my expert colleagues from the Scottish Election Study to talk us through what happened in the election. So tonight we have Professor Ailsa Henderson from the University of Edinburgh. Ailsa has tirelessly served as the principal investigator on the SES since 2014. Yeah, since 2014. It's a lot of work. Professor Robert Johns from the University of Southampton, who helped reestablish and reinvigorate the SES when he served as principal investigator from 2007 to 2011. And Dr. Fraser McMillan, also from the University of Edinburgh, who has consistently infused the election study with his comparative youthful vigor since he joined the team in 2021. So tonight we will cover, Rob will cover the election basics with a sort of long view and what bloc politics is looking like. I'll come back to talk about the demographics in the vote and add in a few little observations. Fraser will talk about the insurgent parties, and Ailsa will bring us to the constitutional question and questions about mandate and that sort of thing. Before I turn over to Rob, I did quickly want to give a note about the data that we'll be relying on for this presentation, for the most part. So the Scottish Election Study is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. Thank you, ESRC, for your support. And we run surveys before and after the election. So it's a panel. Going back, we run it before. We end up with about a bit more than 4,000 respondents. And then we go back to those respondents after the election and run the second wave. We are conducting an oversample of young people. We're not really going to focus on that tonight because we're still waiting for the data from YouGov on that one. But that will be a component of the election study when we have those data. And generally speaking, our questionnaire, what we do with every election is we have a time series of questions that we ask, and then we evaluate that, which ones we want to continue on, and which questions we need to add for the sort of contemporary circumstances as it were. So there is a note in a somewhat substantial health warning to add about the post data. That is, these are interim data at this stage. YouGov hasn't supplied us with the final post-election data yet, which will have the appropriate weights. Should say that actually our unweighted data does fairly closely match the actual election result, with the biggest sort of variant that we see is a slightly inflated green list vote by around 5%. So we feel reasonably satisfied talking about these data, but we would say that there is that health warning, and we're not really going to talk much about point estimates. So we're talking about patterns, and we're fairly certain that the patterns that we will be talking about will hold up as we go through. So with that health warning, I shall turn over to Rob.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks to the ESRC, and thanks everyone for coming. I've got an easier job in the sense that I'm not going to dig very deeply into the data that Chris was just outlining, because my job is to do the bit that actually is a slightly waste of time, because an educated audience like the one I see in front of me clearly knows what happened in the election. Nobody needs really to be told about that kind of stuff, because you'll have been glued as those results came in, and nobody really needs to be told that the SNP's route to getting fairly close to a majority is the fact that if you have your vote fairly evenly spread across the country and it's high enough, you will pick up a hell of a lot of constituency seats, and there are a lot of constituencies relative to list seats, and nearly sweeping the constituency board is already taking you most of the way to at least to office. I'm going to instead place the election in context, both looking backward and starting to talk about what the shape of Scottish electoral politics looks like. And I deliberately say electoral politics rather than party politics, because in a way my conclusion will be that parties are altogether a bit less important in all this than we are accustomed to thinking of them as being. But let's first take the long view backwards. So, there have now been 7 Scottish Parliament elections, and I'm going to cluster the first 6 into pairs. And I'm going to talk first about the first 2, where one of the big themes was about whether people were actually voting on what was going on in the Holyrood context, or whether they were instead casting what's called a second order vote, where they were really commenting on what was going on in London at the time. And John Curtis and colleagues looked at this question in great detail, and being reputable academics, they came to the conclusion that there was a bit of both, but there was quite a lot of commenting on London. The next pair of elections was the first ones that we covered, and we went to town rather on the notion that actually it was getting a bit more first order, that people were actually starting to think, the Scottish government does stuff, and we want the people who seem likely to do it best in office. The SNP achieved that status as the most competent, partly by dint of downplaying their commitment to independence, but of course when they won their majority, they had little option but to call the referendum that completely changed the nature of Scottish Parliament elections, which can be crudely but not wildly unfairly characterised in the 2 subsequent post-referendum elections as an opportunity to express forcibly once more one's view on the independence question. Now, of course, these are clumsy. Of course, plenty of people in 2007 were actually voting on their constitutional preferences. Of course, there were people in 2003 who were looking at what was happening in the Scottish government. So all of this stuff is approximate. And that makes it more forgivable for me to say that actually in 2026, it was kind of like a bit of all 3 of those. It was more of the third, but there was plenty of everything in there. And I'm just going to flesh that out in the next little part. So let's talk about the competence component. And what that does best in terms of explaining the pattern of results you saw briefly on the first slide is explaining why the SNP vote share went down. And you can see, and Ailsa is going to talk more about this in her section, that it was already on the slide before the real troubles, but they accentuated this decline. And when you look at evaluations of the Scottish government's performance, you can see that they were on the slide throughout this term. And crucially, they were not people who had voted no in the referendum or intended to vote no in a future referendum already disliked the Scottish government. There wasn't much scope for them to get to take an any dimmer view. But among those people who were clearly the SNP's base, there was a progressively more negative evaluation of their performance in office. And that is part of the reason why they lost quite a substantial chunk of votes. And this graph, I think, is nicely telling of that, well, it partly tells you something about how surprisingly able they were to harness a positive mood. I was saying this yesterday in the same presentation, that it seems inconceivable looking at the left-hand side of that graph that there would be a point in time at which more people asked about a political object said, yes, it's going in the right direction, because we're now so used to everything being in the catastrophically wrong direction. But back in 2022, more people thought that Scotland was moving in the right direction than the wrong direction. And obviously that's changed a lot. And no incumbent government looking at that graph will think that spells good news for them. Now on to the second order bit, the getting distracted by what's happening in London. And that same polling trajectory has a big turning point in it for the red line, Labour, and that turning point was the election of Keir Starmer as Prime Minister. And nobody can say for absolute certain that that's the causal path, but certainly Anna Sarwar was pretty convinced that that's the reason why things started to go downhill, and for what it's worth, I agree with him. And the UK government's ratings, the Scottish governments were hardly spectacular, as you have already seen, but the UK governments were always worse, and that did not change one iota when Labour took over from the Conservatives. Now on to the third bit, the IndyRef rerun. This is the breakdown of constituency votes by when we asked people in our election survey whether they would vote yes or no if there were a second independence referendum. And you don't need me to tell you that there's a wildly different profile of those two graphs. And it's wildly different if you look at the list votes, with the big difference, of course, being that on the list vote, the yes vote is not a one-party state that you see there. It's the nearly two-party duopoly that is in operation there. And these graphs also highlight just how divided the unionist vote was. It's bigger, but it's split best part of 4 ways, remarkably even split of those votes. And that's, of course, a major part of the story of the election outcome. Now, there are various ways of calculating the figure that really underlies this, which is what percentage of people are voting in the Scottish Parliament elections along with their IndyRef alignment. And one of the reasons there are different ways of doing that is because some people don't really have much of an IndyRef alignment anymore, especially people who are newer to the electorate and so weren't around when all the fuss was made. What I've done here is only taken those people who report a clear view on the independence question and who voted for one of the 6 parties you've just seen on the graphs there. So you can, this is in that sense an overestimate, because there will be people whose votes weren't really in line with their IndyRef preference because they don't really, as I say, have such a strong one. So this is a maximalist version of this statistic. Nonetheless, even allowing for that, these are strikingly large percentages and barely down from doing the same with comparable data 5 years ago. 12 years ago, there was this referendum, and 12 years later, you can predict very accurately which parties people will split between. Can't predict which one they'll vote for necessarily, but you can predict which ones they won't vote for still remarkably well. And that is what explains a kind of paradox, is too high-flown a term, but there was this feeling about that election that's just gone, which there was a lot of volatility about, in the sense that there were big shifts in vote shares. And if you turn the overall results into the fancy political science Pedersen index of volatility, you see that 2026 saw this huge spike in basically just vote switching between elections. And according to our survey data, you've got large proportions of individuals shifting party between 2021 and 26. So that feels like a very exciting, volatile election, while at the same time, not many people regard it, it seems, as having been all that thrilling an election. It didn't necessarily feel that volatile, and certainly the turnout didn't speak of an election that energized people. And I think part of the resolution of that paradox, if you like, is that we do know pretty well how people are going to vote now, even if the voting within the yes or no camps is more unpredictable. There's a very unpleasant looking graph which shows the extent of individual level switching. And that looks tortuous. But you know that if this graph simply showed yes parties and no parties, it would look much more undramatic, because the vast majority of people who voted for a yes party in 2021 went on to do so again in 2026. And we've, led by Ailsa, talked a lot about tribes because that seems quite a nice way of encapsulating what's going on. But tribes headed yes and no, and latterly remain and leave, not individual parties. And of course, that too is a simplification, because there are still people who feel loyal to parties, but far fewer. And it's the SNP where things get blurred, because they are so synonymous with one side that there are still people who don't support the SNP particularly, but like them a lot more than they would, because they are yes supporters, and that's who the SNP is, or that's what the SNP is all about. And of course, there are people who despise the SNP because the SNP is the yes party. What's interesting is if you ask people how they vote, and Ailsa will show something similar to this later, these were the why are you going to vote that way responses from the pre-election survey. And you see, people don't say, I'm trying to stop independence. They say, we're trying to stop the SNP, whether they're Tories or Lib Dems or Reform voters. But it's hard not to think that this is really an expression of constitutional preference channeled through the party that is so closely associated with it. And all of this is pretty familiar for those who've been following politics in the wider UK since the Brexit referendum, because they're having exactly the same conversations about constitutional blocks and how you can't necessarily be sure which party people will vote for, but you know which ones they won't vote for because they're the ones that they disagree about on Brexit specifically, and a lot of the ideological stuff that lies beneath it. Let's have a quick look at how people in the different blocks see the parties, not just how they voted, but this is how much we call it PTV, the probability to vote, as in they give a score from 0, never dream of voting for them, to 10, absolutely could vote for this party. And what you see is something similar to the vote shares. People who are no supporters, on average, have the various unionist options hovering in the 4 to 6 category. No one of those parties is winning anything like the kind of large-scale support. And of course, they don't want to vote for the SNP or Greens, whereas both of the yes parties are pretty popular on average with yes supporters. Labour and the Lib Dems, not inconceivable. And that polling trend you saw with Labour actually doing pretty well and looking as if it might overtake the SNP at some point, clearly reflected the fact that some people who supported independence were nonetheless considering a Labour vote at that point in proceedings, but changed their mind. And the last thing I've got to talk about in the -1 minute that I have remaining is one expression of this new politics, which is if you don't particularly fixate on a party, but you belong to a bloc and you like people who agree with you on that, then with 2 votes, you have the opportunity to vote for 2 parties, either tactically or expressively, if you like, as in if you just like the SNP and Greens, you can vote that way. There was already plenty of this in 2021. There was plenty of it in 2026. This is not a table, it's somewhat overkill for the statistics I'm reading out here, but they're such as it is. And here's that pattern of, much less digestible table, but let's pick out some things. Around pushing half of the split tickets where people vote for a different party on the constituency vote from the list vote were that expected pattern. SNP on the constituencies, because that's all you had, and Greens on the list. And then you've got a right old mixture of what you might see as unionist ticket splitting, some of which will be tactical, some of which maybe not so much. A little bit of a sign that people who were on the soft left of politics, who quite liked the Greens and weren't fixated on independence when casting their vote. And of course, that 90% isn't 100%. And even that 90% probably overestimates the power of IndyRef, although it remains still very powerful. And when people are asked why they ticket splitted, they give the answers you might expect. There are some interesting, odd views on there, and some nice stuff like wanting to make sure there's a wide variety of voices, and maybe the kind of thing people feel they should say, but it may well reflect the fact that people like the opportunity of having 2 votes to get more parties in there. But the big responses are what you'd expect. Lots of people who like the Greens saying, but what choice did I have? And lots of people saying, wasn't any point in voting SNP. And Fraser will talk more about the SNP Green love-in and how far it stretches when he does his section, which is coming up. Meanwhile, thanks very much.
So I'm back. So I'll talk about some basic sort of bivariate, or slightly more complicated than that, demographics. Talk a little bit about change from 2021, and then just a few sort of additional interesting factoids that I pulled out. So starting off, looking at age groups. Not surprisingly, we see the S&P decline over the years from 16 to 24-year-olds to plus 65. We see support decline over time, and we see reform support climbing upwards and sort of hitting its peak for the 50 to 64 age group, and then dropping off slightly for the 65s. Now, much to the horror of my colleagues here, I have all of these demographic things for both constituency and list, mostly for what Rob has already hinted at, that we have seen a fair difference in the voting patterns across the parties, particularly because we're adding in the Greens on the list, obviously, and people are switching around. So the patterns too change between constituency and list, which is an interesting thing in and of itself. But what I'm going to do is start flying through these pretty quickly, and you're going to end up like in the sort of, what is it, Clockwork Orange thing where he's steering a little. So there's going to be an element of that. I apologize in advance, but if you have questions, we can ask them at the Q&A. So for the regional list, you see that the Greens were quite popular amongst younger voters. Again, this is where the health warning comes in, because we do know that we are slightly overestimating the number of people who said that they voted Green on the list. So that's why I sort of grayed out the green bars, just to remind us, just the pattern's probably going to hold up, but just the sort of health warning. And then again, we saw the climb in the reform vote. So what about by sex? Here we see another pattern that's going to appear over and over again. The idea that men were in fact more inclined to vote reform than were women. On the other hand, Lib Dems got a bump amongst women this time around. And we see a similar sort of thing coming on the regional list. Now, what if we look at the combination of age and sex? You'll be happy to know that I have a larger version of that graph so that you can see it a bit better. One crucial thing to point out before I start going through some of these, though, is look at the scales. Look at the scales on the y-axis. You'll see green goes up to 70. What that's telling you that in our data, just shy of 2/3 of young women said that they voted Green on the list. Whereas a bit more than about 46, 47% of young men said they voted Green on the list. Big difference for those young people. We do also see that this dynamic where men supporting reform a bit more, with particularly amongst young men, but then also amongst the sort of older groups. It drops to equal on 25 to 34. So that group, we didn't really see the disparity there. The other interesting thing, labor, is the difference between male and female support for labor is an interesting little thing to look at as well. So this is what this sort of looks like. If you just look at the S&P vote, the difference between the S&P constituency vote and list vote, and you can see where you have that drop off amongst younger people, that larger gap between how they voted on the constituency and how they voted on the list. And you can imagine, given already some of the things that have been said, that the Greens come into to factor there. Right, now education, we see that S&P does its best amongst degree level, people with university or higher degrees, and reform does best amongst people with fewer formal educational qualifications. And similar sort of thing amongst the regional list, but of course the Greens come in and the Greens do quite well on the list amongst people with degrees. Urban rural, the S&P held up pretty well across urban, sort of suburbs, small towns, and rural areas. But you do see that sort of dip with reform in the suburbs a bit. But reform actually holding up about the same in urban as it does in rural areas there. And you can see the Conservatives managed to hold out a bit more amongst rural areas. Not a huge surprise there, I imagine. And Labour does a bit better in urban areas. A flatter pattern, but nothing terribly dissimilar on the regional list for that. Religion. With religion, you see that for Church of Scotland and for Catholics and for other Protestant denominations, SNP doing quite well. But you see Reform doing pretty well amongst those mainline Christian denominations. And on the list, you see that Reform actually does quite well, say, for instance, amongst Anglicans and amongst Church of Scotland. On the list, Reform actually did pretty well amongst that. We've been talking about this, and probably one thing to do with this would be look at this by age as well, because we know that older people tend to identify as belonging to the Christian denominations or as being religious, generally speaking, than younger people. Right, some change figures. So looking at the combination of men and women and age, so sex and age with change. Now remember, Reform is coming from 0, right? So the big change for Reform is the fact that they now exist and they got the seats and they got the votes. But you see the drop, and apologies, the colors have shifted, but the drop in SNP and the climb in Greens, particularly amongst women, is quite substantial. And there you can see also where the drop in Conservatives and the climb in Reform. Amongst religion, not a dissimilar story. Again, the decline, particularly in Conservative vote, amongst the sort of mainline Christian denominations, and the growth in Reform. And amongst the education qualifications, again, that similar sort of pattern that we just saw in those previous graphs. Right, so to the factoid stage. So one of the things that we were quite interested in asking in this, as I said, we start with our core survey that we run over and over again, but then we adjust for current circumstances. And one of the big current circumstances was this was going to be the AI election, right? This is the one where deep fakes were going to flood the zone right before the election, and it was going to be everybody looking at ChatGPT and Claude to tell them how they should vote, et cetera, right? This was some of the big concerns that were being expressed. So we did a bit more, deep dive into asking people their information sources than we've done in previous SES. And this is just the whole sample. And what we find is legacy information sources sit at the ones that people refer to the most. If you break it down by age, it does change a bit. For the younger people, perhaps not surprisingly, social media becomes the first information source that they look to. Then family and friends, then party websites, then leaflets. AI sits almost at the bottom, 3 up from the bottom. So not a lot of reporting of turning to AI. Now, I guess we also have young people also not telling us that they're using AI to write their essays either. But I'm guessing that there's less of an incentive in this circumstance to perhaps deviate from the truth. For the 25, basically to 49 group, family and friends tops it. And then for 25 to 34, social media, leaflets. And for 35 to 49, family, friends, TV, radio, leaflets. So as we get older, we start seeing people looking to more of the sort of standard legacy information sources. By the time we get to 65 plus, TV, radio, newspapers, leaflets, and then family, friends, and all that. So AI sits at the bottom for basically almost everybody, right near the bottom. I mean, basically AI is sitting about, even for young people, where the Electoral Commission sits. And I don't think a lot of young people are going to the Electoral Commission for a lot of information relating to the election. I like the Electoral Commission is fantastic. They do great work. I just don't think they're really exciting with the young demographic. But even for older people, it still sits towards the bottom. Right. So The other thing to point out that I kind of found interesting in this, leaflets. Leaflets are still sitting in the top 3 for almost every one of these age groups, except for very young, and it's number 4. Leaflets hold up better than AI and chatbots. There you go. Last fun little factoid, we asked people how happy or disappointed they were with the election outcome. If we break this down by party and men and women, what we find is the SNP, not surprisingly, report being the happiest. The SNP voters say that they were the happiest with the outcome, but they weren't exactly ecstatic with the outcome. They weren't jumping for joy, and champagne corks aren't flying. I'm sure on the night it were, but generally speaking. And the Greens are even less happy with it. The Greens, who did fantastically, they got their first 2 constituencies, right? And the highest number of MSPs that they've had so far. They're not jumping up and down. The most interesting, I thought, was Reform. Reform are almost as despondent as our conservative voters. Reform, they went from nothing, to 2nd place, tied with Labour. And yet, for some reason, they're saying they're not happy. Now, maybe it's because for the most part, their disliked party ended up being the largest, possibly. Maybe they had unrealistic expectations about where they thought they would end up. But it is quite interesting that they're just not exactly overwhelmed with joy and excitement by the outcome of that. Right, and with that, I shall hand over to Fraser.
Right, so what I'm going to talk about is mostly Reform and the Greens, and this will be very complementary to what Rob and Chris have already said, just taking a kind of closer look at where those parties' support came from. And obviously, we're in a fragmented sort of political landscape all across the UK, and Scotland is, like everywhere else, a kind of example of that. And that's what I have in the first bullet point here. So the combined, a really interesting fact from this election is that the combined big 3 vote share for the Conservatives, Labour and the SNP dropped from 91.2% in 2021 to 69.2% in constituencies in 2026. It went from 81% to 55% on the list, right? So the list is where we're seeing the biggest divergence away from these mainstream parties. What all these parties have in common is that they were in government at either level at some point over the last few years, like the COVID era and before. Labour dropped the least in vote share, but they obviously peaked in the polling 2 years before, around the time of the general election, and fell off a cliff ever since. The Lib Dems gained a wee bit, particularly picking up in constituencies, but the main beneficiaries of this movement away from the mainstream parties were Reform and the Greens at either end of the ideological spectrum, both arguably sort of anti-system parties. Greens were obviously in government with the SNP in a kind of, I can't believe it's not a coalition deal for a couple of years, but the only person whose political career that really ended was Humza Yousaf's, and they got out relatively unscathed. So where did these votes come from? Now, this is a much neater version of the earlier graph, showing basically transfers on the regional list from 2021 to 2026. And what you see is Reform UK among their supporters. These are all the people in our sample from the post-election wave who voted Reform on the list. And you can see that basically half of their vote, oh dear. Oh, it's back. Basically half of their vote came direct transfers from the Scottish Conservatives. They got another little chunk from the SNP and Labour, as well as previous non-voters. And most of those people were the sort of low propensity people who were eligible to vote but didn't previously do so. And then another few from other places. So by and large, Conservatives, and then picking up kind of natural supporters from all other parts of the political spectrum. For the Scottish Greens, they held on to a substantial chunk of their 2021 list vote and bolstered that with a large number of transfers from the SNP. I'm going to take a look in a minute at whether those were, looks like we're battling with technology again, whether those are habitual SNP voters giving the Greens a sort of strategic second vote, or primarily sort of Green supporters who have come across from the SNP. They also have a large chunk of people who didn't previously vote, and most of those are folk who have since 2021 aged into the electorate. So it's that younger group that are voting Green at very, very high margins. So around 1 in 8 voters at this election, relating back to what Rob said, voted a split ballot with the SNP in the constituency and Green on the list. And this graph basically shows the propensity to vote scores for the SNP and Greens. I subtracted one from the other to work out which party these split ticket voters, constituency SNP, list Green, really prefer. And it's pretty evenly split. So on the left, you've got people who give the Greens a higher score than the SNP. On the right, you have people who give the SNP a higher score than the Greens. And in the middle, people who give both an equal score. And the plurality here are people who like both those parties equally. And people who sort of really prefer the SNP slightly outnumber people who sort of more prefer the Greens. But this is not a case of just one thing happening. It is people who are both voting, Green supporters who are voting strategically in the constituency, and SNP supporters who are voting strategically Green on the list. And that kind of pincer movement is what helped those parties get over the line with an extended pro-independence majority in the Scottish Parliament. Looking closer at Reform, one striking thing about those supporters, those voters, is that they are the most loyal across both ballots. So as a share, this is looking at every party as a share of the total number of voters they got casting a ballot for them on either half of the constituency or list. Reform have by far the highest retention. Almost 3/4 of their voters at the recent election gave them both the constituency and list ballot. And we saw that in the opinion poll and leading up to the election. There was always a relatively small gap between Reform support on each of constituency and list. And that suggests that they are, the kind of plague on all your houses parties. They weren't voting strategically to the same extent as other pro-union parties. And that partly explains why, even though there's been an increase in tactical voting in split ticket voting on the pro-independent side, there's been a corresponding decrease on the anti-independent side, because a lot of anti-independence voters have gone over to Reform and they're not interested in playing strategic games and splitting their ballot because they hate everyone else. It also shows that both of these parties are filling a gap in the electoral market. So if you look at self-reported left-right attitudes across the party, so 0 is furthest left, 10 is furthest right, basically there's a missing half in the distribution for the Greens and Reform. Essentially, there are no right-of-centre Green voters and there are no left-of-centre Reform voters. Their support is actually a bit more spread out. That they've got more of a concentration in the middle than the Scottish Conservatives, who sort of peak in the 7 and 8s. But basically, this demonstrates that you could fuse these two groups together and you'd have a very flat distribution across the ideological spectrum. Everyone else is more or less sort of the centre of gravity of Scottish politics, which is slightly left of centre. But the Greens and Reform are very distinctive in this regard. These differences extend to real issues. So I've got a couple here. The first one is, should there be new drilling for North Sea oil and gas? And Reform supporters are overwhelmingly in favour of that. The electorate overall is sort of broadly in favour, but it's far from unanimous. And the SNP could have issues if you look at the bottom left there, because their support is very, very sort of split on this. It's flat across the agree-disagree drilling question. The Scottish Greens are the least supportive of more drilling for North Sea oil, unsurprisingly, but even there's a bit of variation that you don't really see with Reform supporters. Looking at the immigration question, this is even more stark. So we asked, should basically there be more immigration to Scotland from foreign countries? And Reform supporters, unsurprisingly, about 90% strongly disagree on that. That is not mirrored in the opposite direction with Greens, SNP, Labour and Lib Dems, although very few Green supporters will say that they would like less immigration. Although I suspect there might be some social desirability going on with the neither category there for the kind of left-leaning parties. So reform supporters in particular have a very, very distinctive ideological profile within the Scottish electorate. Coming back to this question about the age divide, this basically just takes some of the stuff that Chris was already showing and plots these two parties across the age distribution. It's much, much more linear and steep for the Greens, right? They have, with all the caveats about weights and the difficulties of reaching younger respondents, they have a very, very high share of the vote among the youngest voters. And by the time you get to sort of the upper end of the age distribution, it's in the lower single digits. Whereas Reform peak around that sort of late middle age area and actually have a bit of a lower vote share among the very oldest voters. This is the final slide from me, and it's basically taking those propensity to vote scores that Rob showed earlier, so 0 to 10 ratings of each party, and correlating them with each other. So and this demonstrates essentially that we've entered a sort of 3-block system, and that the insurgent parties are acting as complements to the existing, or well, in the case of Reform UK, a replacement for the Scottish Conservatives. But basically those 3 green boxes, SNP and the Scottish Greens, Labour and the Liberal Democrats, and the Conservatives Reform UK, show that there's a decent degree of complementarity in attitudes to each of these parties across the electorate, right? So you've got the pro-union right of centre bloc, the pro-union left of centre bloc, and then the pro-independence left of centre bloc. And there's a good degree of complementarity there. Obviously, the pro-independence bloc is fishing in a smaller pool. There are fewer parties competing for votes, and they can strategically game the electoral system to, pretty strong effect. So that's part of the story of how the SNP won this election again, was with the help of the Scottish Greens stepping aside a lot of constituencies. I'm going to hand over to Ailsa now for the fun bit about independence attitudes.
Thanks very much, everyone. So I'm looking at the relationship between constitutional preferences and party preferences, and I've done 2 recent blogs on this that are on our website. So I don't intend to restate what's in all of those, but one of them is about whether we can actually identify a middle ground constitutionally in Scotland. How can we try and force one to exist? And then what do we know about the relationship between the election results and whether people perceive there to be a mandate? I'll speak a little bit about that in this presentation. So Rob earlier talked about the competence issue and looked at decreased Scottish Government approval, and also looked at the trend graph for Scottish vote, for SNP vote intention. What I've done is I've plotted 3 things on this graph. One is the dark line, which is government approval, which was falling off a cliff from the moment of 2021. So it predates the departure of Nicola Sturgeon as First Minister. I've put dotted lines on there for the Supreme Court judgment on whether Scottish Parliament had the competence to call a referendum on its own, a dotted line for the change in leadership the first time, and then a dotted line for the second change in leadership for the SNP. So government approval falling sharply. Vote intention for the SNP falling, but in a more shallow way, but unrelated almost to this is the dotted line at the top, which is support for independence. So independence remained fairly flat in a context in which there was a sharp decrease in government approval and a shallower decrease in terms of support for the SNP. Do I press it again? What was the next?
I think it's probably reheating.
It's what? It's reheating? Do I?
There you go. Maybe you pressed the wrong button.
Okay. No, that's right. That's right. Okay. Oh my word! I thought I was going to have to mimic the shape of the graphs. So were people voting according to constitutional lines in this election? As Rob said, a good academic answer is a little bit yes and a little bit no. So yes, the answer is a little bit yes and a little bit no. We can look at it in terms of constitutional alignment. This is a slightly different way of looking at what Rob had put up earlier, and this is the minimalist position rather than the maximalist position. But what you can see is the proportion of yes voters and no voters who were casting a ballot for a party that shared their constitutional preferences in 2011, where more than half were doing it. And then the following years, 2016, 21, and 26, where there was a much stronger degree of alignment between your constitutional preferences and your party preferences. So on that measure, yes, there was a relationship between constitutional preferences and party preferences. But the other way we can look at it is not alignment, but in terms of intention. What message were people trying to send with their ballot? And we started asking this question before the 2024 UK general election, because at the time the SNP was trying to treat the election as a de facto referendum on independence. We wanted to know, well, do voters interpret it that way, or are they actually casting a ballot for government formation, which is in fact what they were doing? So we've been repeating that question ever since, and this time it's asked in the context of a Hollywood election. Were you trying to elect as many pro-indie MSPs as possible, as many pro-union MSPs as possible? Were you voting according to government formation? Were you trying to keep the SNP in office? Were you trying to remove the SNP from office? None of these are don't know. So the red bars are the no voters, blue bars are the yes voters. And what you can see is that overwhelmingly no voters were casting a ballot on government formation, not on constitutional lines. They were trying to remove the SNP from office. For yes voters, it was split. More people were intending to send a constitutional message with their vote. But there was a healthy number of people who were actually making a comment on government formation rather than constitutional politics. So on alignment, yes, people were voting on constitutional grounds. In terms of intention, slightly less so. So is there a mandate for an independence referendum? These are older data from June 2025. This is the baseline question. Who should have the right to call a referendum? The Scottish electorate position as a whole is that the Scottish government should be able to call that referendum. In part, that is in opposition to the view of no voters, which is not that the UK government should be the one that has a right to call, but actually that there should never be another referendum again. And therefore, it doesn't really matter who technically has the right to call it. So yes, voters are overwhelmingly of the view that it should be the Scottish government that has that right. And enough no voters or no supporters also believe that is, in fact, the majority preference. Now, do elections deliver mandates? We asked that question. Is there already a mandate? Will this election determine whether there's a mandate to have a referendum, or can elections not confer mandates? And so what you can see here is, again, a sharp difference depending on your constitutional preference. No voters are of the view that elections can't deliver mandates at all. Yes, voters are split between there already being a mandate and this election being the one thing that will determine it. Although a healthy number of no voters also believe that. Of those who said elections do matter, we asked, well, what kind of election result would provide the mandate? And if we look here, an SNP majority, there is agreement across both yes and no voters. These are changes from 21 in there as well. An SNP majority would deliver a mandate to call a referendum. On a pro-indie party majority, we see lower levels of agreement and a bigger gap between yes supporters and no supporters. And then on whether the SNP was just the largest party, there's far lower levels of agreement, and again, agreement between yes and no supporters. But of course, if we're looking at constitutional preferences, we can look at the binary issue of yes and no, but we can also look at an older question that offers more constitutional options. So that includes independence within the EU, independence outside the EU, the status quo, Parliament with no tax-varying powers, and abolishing the Scottish Parliament. And what I've got here are 2 points in time: the 2016 data from the Scottish Social Attitude Survey and our 2026 data. They're usually a dot. If it's a star, that's because that was that party's preferred constitutional option at that moment in time. What we see in the decade since 2016 is that there has been, among yes supporters, an increase in support for independence within the EU. In part, that is explained by the dropping off in support for independence outside the EU, particularly among SNP supporters. There has been a decrease in support for the status quo. Some of that is explained by an increase in support for a parliament that does not have tax-varying powers, but the engine of most of it is actually a sharp rise in the proportion of people who support abolishing the Scottish Parliament among supporters of the Conservative Party. This is almost a doubling in support for abolition since 2016. It is now the preferred constitutional option of Conservative supporters and Reform supporters. Now, our data allow us to look ahead a little bit, and I have 3 things to say about that. The first is about no voters. We wanted to understand these constitutional preferences, and we don't really talk about removing powers from the Scottish Parliament very much. So we wanted a new question, and we asked, would you like to abolish the Scottish Parliament? Would you like a parliament with fewer powers, the status quo, and more powers? And for the electorate as a whole, which is at the top there, it's fairly evenly split between abolish and fewer and status quo and more. Among supporters of the Reform and Conservative parties, in fact, the balance of opinion is in support of abolishing the Scottish Parliament or having fewer powers. If you're looking at where the support for having more powers for the Scottish Parliament, it is in fact strongest among parties that want Scotland to become independent. If you look at other pro-union parties like Labour and the Lib Dems, they are on balance supportive, but of the status quo and more parties, but more powers, but in large part because of their support for the status quo. So that's no voters. The question we posed to yes voters was slightly different. We said, look, the UK government has said they're not going to allow another referendum. What do you think they should do? And we allowed people to use their own words when they said that. 978 people responded to that question, and I've coded them. There are 5 main codes. So take some sort of action within Scotland, have some sort of interaction with the UK government. This will become clear when I talk about the subcategories. Make appeals beyond the UK's borders, take some sort of UK-wide actions, that's coordinating with Wales and Northern Ireland that falls in there, and then other, which on the largest part of which is the 23% of the sample or of the codes that didn't have a plan, didn't offer a solution. If we look at the subcategories of action within Scotland, which are blue, and interactions with the UK government, which are red, we can actually code them running from more passive things to do, like wait, and more active things to do. So remember, these are just yes supporters. And what we can see is that the yes electorate is fairly polarized from, on the one hand, just wait for an agreement to come. Or some people said, well, wait for something specific. Sometimes that was a trigger, like a particular result in a series of opinion polls. Or that middle ground, let's pressure the UK government to do something. But by far the most popular answer, I know we're not talking about point estimates, but a large number of people, over 40% of the yes supporters said, you know what, hold it anyway. And that's what we're going to do. So this is a challenge, I think, for the SNP moving forward. The last thing I want to end on is the fact that in some of our data, it looked like we might be seeing a changing in the constitutional poles of debate. So abolish is far more prevalent in support than it used to be. We also know from some of the data we've seen other people generate is that it might be the case that the constitutional blocks, the lines between them are blurring slightly. So there might be an appetite for people to engage in activity beyond those constitutional blocks. We saw that in the Norstat data where Labour and Lib Dem supporters were far more likely to say they would vote for the SNP rather than Reform in a straight vote between the two. In our own data, we know that Labour and Lib Dem supporters would have been happier with an SNP minority administration than they would have been with a pro-union coalition that included Reform. So we wanted to know, well, how much appetite is there for collaboration on the left-right spectrum rather than the constitutional spectrum? And so what we see here is the percentage of support among supporters of each party for collaborating across the left-right divide compared to only collaborating with a party that shares your constitutional view. Now, on the right side of the political spectrum in Scotland, that is a distinction without a difference. But if we're thinking of the left side of the political spectrum, then actually there are cross pressures there in terms of the left-right spectrum and constitutional preferences. Labour supporters are quite open to collaborating across the constitutional divide with other parties on the left and centre-left. Unfortunately, the party they would be looking to, in terms of that possible collaboration, the SNP, have much lower appetite for doing so and are much more likely to say, no, we would prefer to only collaborate with parties that share our view on independence, which is another challenge, I think, moving forward. So I'll end it there. We give these events from time to time, and so we would really like to hear from you what you think about what you would like to see in terms of future events, if you've learned anything from what we've told you today. So we would encourage you to, we've created a little survey for you. It's a very short survey. It doesn't take very long, but if you could scan that QR code and fill in our evaluation form, that would give us some good ideas moving forward. I'll hand it over to Chris.
All right, thanks. Nope, stay up here because we're gonna.
Oh, right. I'm going to need a pen.
Okay. Right, so we'll get settled here and go to questions. Right. So I'm going to hand that and hand it across yourselves. As you, okay. I will stand up here so I can see people. So catch my eye if you have a question. Raise your hand. Whatever. The thing is, though, that what often happens, and I've now decided to say this on a regular basis, at some point I will say, oh goodness, we only have time for one more question. And that's the exact moment when about 10 hands will go up. So if you have a question, catch my eye earlier and try not to wait till the very end, because then we won't be able to get to it. So John's got his hand up first, so we'll go with John.
Thank you. I'm going to take some word back to Rob's initial comments. The second one also relates to Fraser's contribution. Second order. You referred to the decline of the Labour Party up to 2024, but surely if we're looking at second order effects, the decline of the Conservative Party between 2021 and the end of 2022 has to be regarded in Scotland as a second order effect. And I think one could also argue that the rise of the Labour Party in Scotland over that same period is also a second order effect, because they all happen in parallel with changes in the popularity of Conservative and Labour and the opinion polls south of the border. So that's point one. That then kind of partly leads into part two. The suggestion that the relationship between constitutional preference and vote choice on the yes side of the fence, shall we say, does meet a bit of a challenge from the smell test. Because the smell test says, well, back in 2021, when support for independence was running at around 50% on average polls. I know YouGov tested a bit better, but it's about 50%. The SNP got 48% of the vote. Levels of support for independence haven't changed, yet support for the SNP is down to 38%. So just those two facts raise a question about, can it really be true that the constitutional preference is as strongly aligned on the yes side as it was back in 2021? And certainly if you take the average of the opinion polls conducted before the campaign, which by the way, and is worth saying in this audience, the opinion polls were virtually bang on average in this campaign. It's remarkably good. But if you take those, I mean, they're coming in on the constitutional vote with the SNP weighing at about 67% of the yes vote. So I'm kind of curious that you're coming up with an argument that says there hasn't been any noticeable change in the alignment between vote choice and yes preference in the 2026 election.
So on the first points about second order, I mean, I largely agree. I think it's, I mean, I'd be interested in others' take on this. My feeling was that at least in the, let's say, on the upslope towards the fall in Labour's polling share midterm, it wasn't simply a case of the overwhelming unpopularity of the Conservatives, because it was clear that they were winning some support from the SNP. So there was definitely a first order component to that.
There's the initial rise in Labour support, which occurs basically in parallel with the party going through this just fiscal event. There was then a subsequent rise which occurs in the wake of the SNP's debut. So I think you have to disentangle that period. Yeah, I think that's
a fair point. In terms of the alignment of vote, I mean, it was noticeable in Ailsa's graph that whereas in 2016 and 21, the alignment between constitutional preferences, yes, no preferences, and party support was stronger among yeses than it was among noes. That was reversed in Ailsa's data, and it's also true that you're right, the opinion polls have that alignment being even weaker. And this is definitely something that needs a bit more looking into, but certainly once we had corrected the tendency, one of the, not that this would necessarily weaken the overall alignment, but a lot of the polls initially were allowing a lot of people to say that they were going to vote Green on the constituency vote. We were very strong on not letting people do that. You have to be absolutely categorically sure that you were going to have a Green to vote for. And we did find that a very large proportion of yes supporters, when more or less obliged, did then say that they were going to vote for the SNP. But we definitely need to look into our post-election data, which those votes were based on, just to see. And I mean, smell test-wise, I basically agree. But there's the one thing I would say is that, you know, when you choose as your starting off point does matter, because on some polling, and our Scottish Election Survey does not have a relatively high yes support. The overall yes support is slightly lower than the polling average. And then if you're going from like a 50% yes to actually something more like a kind of 43, 44%, then the gap between the drop in SNP support and the drop in yes support is less pronounced. And so it's less smelly in that sense. Anything to...
No, I mean, I would agree with all of that. And the only thing I would say is that when I was running the calculations, I was using a slightly different denominator than Rob was, but also I was using list vote only when I was looking at that. So it's not just the SNP, it's SNP and Greens. And so that's explaining some of what's going on.
I agree with that. Fraser, are we good? Okay. Right. Other questions? What next?
Can I?
There's only time for one more question.
Just on the second order thing, we also try to understand the second order or the first second order nature of Labour's undoing in this election. This is partly continuing a question you asked me 2 weeks ago, but we asked people whose fault. You know, Labour didn't do very well in this election. Whose fault is that? And we effectively asked a Moreno question afterwards. It was UK Labour, not Scottish Labour. UK Labour more than Scottish Labour, equally, and then continued. And what we find for the electorate as a whole, they are absolutely clustered in the first three categories, blaming UK Labour rather than solely Scottish Labour. But if you look at Scottish Labour supporters, they are far more likely to attribute their decline to UK Labour's fault. They've got fewer people in the equally category and more people in the... So they're looking outside for blame there.
The other help warning is that, unless questions are forthcoming, we have a whole lot of exercises.
Oh, there we go. There's the blame one.
Which one did you want?
The blame one. No, blame. Keep going. It was multicolored. There.
They're all multicolored. Would you like to narrate?
Oh, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. I mean, because people, you know, because we didn't want to give an option that had an easy out. Well, it's both their fault. So we thought that by stretching it out into that kind of, we're used to this question in a national identity context. So we thought by stretching it out, we would avoid the, well, they're all to blame kind of option. And, you know, some people do say, oh, they're all to blame. But actually, Labour has we were particularly interested in the views of Labour supporters on this question. And whether they were willing to accept any responsibility for what happened in this election. And it turns out, no, they are absolutely convinced that their undoing was at the feet of their UK Labour colleagues.
Right there. Oh, 1, 2, 3. Thanks.
Yeah, sort of continuing on this, isn't it the case that these two things which you present separately, either is it a second order thing or is it about competence, they are by now completely intertwined, conflated in Scottish politics. Because while some people may vote against or think about voting against the SNP because they are increasingly seen as less competent, others still vote for them because they are still seen as a lot more competent than whatever lot is in the UK. So it's very difficult to separate these questions. So in a way, I mean, there's a comparative conceptualization of political competence in Holyrood and in Westminster, right?
Absolutely. So there's a kind of cost of governing answer to that one, which is we know that the SNP is kept afloat by the fact that so many people in the electorate support independence, by the fact that in a context in which constitutional question is salient, they will always be rewarded for being perceived to stand up for Scotland compared to other Scottish parties, but that there is a constant active comparison between the performance of the Scottish government and the performance of the UK government. And the SNP-led Scottish government has been very fortunate in that the UK government has been deeply unpopular among Scottish voters for almost the entire period that they have been in office. And the other thing we know is at the time of this election, the Keir Starmer's UK Labour administration was less popular among Scottish voters than Boris Johnson's was at the time of the 2021 election. So there's always an active comparison. That said, we do say, how are things going in this domain and that domain, and whose fault is that? And we ask them to decide whether it's the Scottish government's fault or the UK government's fault. And what we find in general is that when things go well, they reward the Scottish government. And when things go badly, they blame the UK government, almost regardless of what the actual lines of legislative competence are. And the other thing I would say on competence is that, yes, I mean, I agree with some of what you're saying, but we can also track the party's perceived competence on a number of domains. And we ask people to evaluate a range of parties rather than saying who's most competent, because we know that will just be who the party that they're voting for. And what we see are really interesting patterns in the competence data. So in a context in which every party had falling competence evaluations, Labour did better in 2024 because it was just falling more slowly than everyone else. But now we're in a situation where in a context in which all competence evaluations are still falling, the SNP's competence evaluations are just falling more slowly than everyone else. So it does really just depend. It's like musical chairs. It depends what time the election is held, who happens to be low in the competence stakes.
Just a couple of questions. One is, was it the case that amongst Labour voters, they were, like other unionist voters, motivated by voting against the SNP? And also among SNP voters, despite what you said about the unpopularity of Keir Starmer's government, do you have a view as to whether had Labour pursued a different strategy, or whether they might have had an opportunity to secure more SNP voters, or maybe keep some of those SNP 2024 voters, had they appealed more to the SNP or pursued a different strategy in any way?
On the first point, the Labour voters are very motivated to get rid of the SNP virtually to the same degree as voters of other pro-union parties. And on the SES website, we have a public opinion dashboard of all of our Scoop survey data from, I guess, 13 cross-sections that we had between the last election and February this year. And you can see basically Labour going up until mid-2024 to about 50% of the pro-union vote. And that dropped like a stone after. And now the pro-union vote is split in all sorts of different directions. And Reform are now the plurality choice there, just marginally. And on the second point, something you couldn't see from the government evaluations graph, those were people saying that each government was doing a good job. When Labour got into office in 2024, there are other options in that question. So people moved from the Tory government's doing a bad job to kind of the middle category. Rather than immediately giving Labour passing marks, there was movement from bad job to sort of neither good nor bad, let's wait and see. But that immediately soured, and those people started moving back into the bad job column. So I don't think there's anything that Scottish Labour could have done differently, basically at all. I think they pursued the least worst sort of strategy by trying to make it a almost presidential contest and say, they've been in power forever. Anna Sarwar was appearing without red behind them. It was, a saltire that said, we need change and we need new leadership. And that was basically the only card they could really have played, I think. And obviously it just didn't work because they're so contaminated by what's going on at Westminster. And as Elsa said, the Scottish government always benefit from that comparison, particularly now that they are down to that kind of core independence vote. And those are people who remain reluctant to point the finger at the SNP. Although, if you look at, the good job, bad job evaluations among that group, that has slid. It's, about only half of pro-Indy supporters now say that the SNP is doing a good job, but it's softened substantially. So most of those people are not saying they're doing a very good job anymore. They've moved to they're doing a good enough job. So it suggests that the SNP could fall further among that group, but as it stands, they seem to have kind of hit the eye right there. When John Swinney got into power, he basically steadied the ship, and that prevented them from sliding further. And I think whether or not that continues to happen is not just dependent on what they do here, but also what happens at UK level.
Just a couple of points about Labour's voters and their openness to the SNP, or at least less outright hostility. One point is that Labour did lose some voters to Reform at this election, and they will be the people who hate the SNP the most amongst this erstwhile vote. So you'd expect a slight softening in that sense. And Ailsa did show the graph which asked people, would you be willing to cooperate across with people on your side of left, right, even if you disagree on independence? Now, the trouble with that is it could be that there is a more openness to the SNP, or it could be that they're just thinking about the Greens, because that's altogether a less offensive way of doing that same thing. And something we could do in future, and in fact have been discussing doing today, is actually asking people which party do you think the MSPs that you like should consider working with, and which you consider beyond the pale, which will shed a bit more light on whether I was prattling confidently about bloc politics, but we don't really know that much about how voters see that landscape.
I think Scottish Labour could have, I don't think any of this was predetermined. I think UK Labour could have governed rather than just fighting the next election. But I also think that Scottish Labour could have distinguished itself, I don't mean behaviourally, I mean it could have identified a wider gap between their policies and the SNP's policies on some issues that might have found a happy audience among the Scottish electorate. On Labour and its animosity to the SNP, yes, and if you look at the PTVs, it's absolutely there. However, there are signs that because they dislike Reform more, there are contexts in which there is a slight softening towards the SNP. And the Norstat data were really clear that they were, basically trying to find the Condorcet winner, right? What about a constituency contest in which there's only these two parties? Who would you support? And it was absolutely clear. 2/3 of the Labour voters said they would vote SNP rather than Reform. 3/4 of Lib Dems, not normally very warm towards the SNP, said they would rather vote SNP than vote Reform. So yes, they're not huge fans of the SNP, but there are signs that because they really don't like Reform, there are contexts in which the constitutional salience becomes less important, and you can see a bit of a softening, but only in those contexts where we are primed to think about Reform, really.
Just a couple of interesting nuggets about the PTV scores. When obviously we had to change the options in the surveys we were doing during the period between the elections, when Reform kind of rose in the polls, and we added them to the propensity to vote batteries. And what happened there was really interesting because just like Ailsa said about softening towards the SNP, the Scottish electorate as a whole modestly softened towards the Scottish Conservatives, because you now had Reform as, in the eyes of many Scottish voters, basically just mega Tories, right? Anchoring that scale. So if you were giving them a 0, you might give the Conservatives a 1 if you were previously giving them a 0. So that's an interesting dynamic there. And on those PTVs, staying very far from the topic of Labour here, but a potential issue for Reform is that about 2/3 of Scottish voters give them a 0 on that 0 to 10 scale, and that could be an issue in England as well. Is that there's a very, very high degree of negative polarisation against Reform, even higher than the degree to which Scottish voters were previously polarised against the Conservatives.
And that's connected to tactical voting.
Right. Here. Sure.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, the previous question has dealt with a number of the points that I was going to ask. And a lot of the focus has been on the performance of Labour relative to where it was polling a few years ago. But if you look at how it compares to the last election, the change is smaller, I think, than any other party. It was minus 2.4%. From a very low base, of course. But my question is, and it also relates to the sort of flat red line that you had on your party, your longer term party graph. Is this sort of the motivation for people voting Labour? Is this the sort of core Labour vote that people will vote Labour almost anyway? I mean, do you have any insight into what it was that people were voting Labour for? You've given a lot of reasons why people didn't vote Labour, but why did the vote change so little?
Okay, well, I mean, I think that it is very clear that what happened after the independence referendum was a wholesale shift of a chunk of Labour vote that is not going to return. I think people like me have spent, people like us have spent a lot of time saying, oh yes, that's probably them down to their base about traditional parties, and then watched that shrink ever further. So I'd be hesitant to say this is as bad as it will get. And you were right to say that Labour didn't lose very much, but if you told Labour in 2021, don't worry, you'll only lose a little bit more in 2026, I think they would have been truly horrified. And I think that, a feature of the new politics that we have to get used to is that, now Labour are a pretty minor party in Scotland. They're not very minor, but they are, they're a pretty minor player, and it's not that easy to see. Well, there are two interpretations of this. One is that what happened midterm was all very heartening, and if only Keir Starmer had not won the election, everything would have been fine. The other is to say, well, actually, once Labour, once an electorate that was pretty unimpressed by Labour as a party, as a symbol, had started to contemplate them in the run-up to the 2026 general election, the 2026 Scottish Parliament election, that polling line would have dipped again. What I don't know off the top of my head, I don't know if anyone else does, what we would need to know is what the results are of our party identification question, because we have this question that asks, never mind who you vote for, do you think of yourself as this and how strongly so? And I just don't know what proportion of Labour's vote was actually saying, yeah, we really feel Labour, we feel fairly or very strongly Labour, and that would be a reassuring sign that there's not much more to lose. But the general trend in party loyalties is not great for Labour, and a lot of those people are exiting the electorate, to use the euphemism. And so, yeah, I'm not sure I've got much positive news. Anyone else?
I have two things to say. I think I have a slightly more positive take, but the one thing we did was at one point was look at age and gender and look at the patterns of loss and gain for different parties. And if you look at the losses, so there were three parties that were fundamentally losers in this election in terms of losing democratic support compared to 2021. And that was the SNP and the Conservatives and Labour. And the SNP and Conservatives have clear age profiles to their losses, in the sense that the SNP were losing younger voters, particularly young women. Conservatives were losing predominantly older voters, particularly older male voters. The SNP loss trend is fairly flat across ages and genders. So they were losing a flat distribution across that. So they were losing equally across ages and losing equally across genders, which is, I think, an interesting distinction from what was happening to the SNP and the Conservatives. The other thing, we have a habit of comparing electoral performance to the most recent election. And in that case, that would force us to be looking to 2024. I think if you're comparing Labour performance to the 2019 European election in Scotland, I think they did not so badly. They came fifth in that election. I mean, not that long ago, Labour was in a situation where at every election, they were losing half their support. So they're not in that situation anymore. And so they have, I think, been in tighter electoral positions before. Whether they have been in tighter political situations is less clear.
So basically, don't worry, the petrol prices were much higher in the 70s, so it's not too bad right now.
Going back that far.
Right, we do literally have time for one more question. Over there. Susan, all the way over. Please.
Thank you. So the graphs would suggest that the Greens have the most enviable position, with young people entering to vote for the first time having the greatest propensity to vote for the Greens. And the thing that struck me in the Green profile was what I was going to call it pragmatism, perhaps I shouldn't, but if you looked at the response to drilling for oil and also immigration, that kind of surprised me, that there was more of a distribution there than I might have imagined, certainly more of a distribution than on the reform side, where it was clearly very strongly weighted. So I wonder, does that then give the Greens a policy space to reach up in the age demographic? Does it suggest that there's more pragmatism within that group and openness to taking a less binary policy position within the Green Party as a way of reaching up into the age demographic, which would further strengthen the position in addition to the new entrants?
I think a problem for Greens, the Scottish Greens and the Green Party England and Wales, is that they are very ideologically committed to the principle of member-led policy making, and that their voters, not to the same extent as the Forum, but they stand out in the electorate in their attitudes compared to other parties, and I just don't think it's possible for them to deviate or soften their position on things that are very, very important to their members, like their position on immigration or their position on North Sea oil and gas. So I think they correctly identified that they have a very particular niche in the Scottish electorate, and the high level of compatibility between, or the way that most sort of pro-indie voters would see the compatibility between the Greens and the SNP, meant that their best bet was basically to try and maximise that sort of strategic split voting. And obviously that is what contributed to a result where significantly more people voted for anti-independence parties, but we nonetheless have a fairly convincing pro-independence majority in Parliament, the biggest so far. And I think as long as they don't have to actually get into government, they can continue to do that. And the way that I've heard Green people speak about the way they write the manifesto is that they basically stack it with like maximalist demands that they can then use as bargaining chips in any type of policy negotiations. So I think they see, for them, the best thing is to maybe not get their hands dirty and have to deal with messy compromises on public spending and things like that, and continue to just juice that young, university educated urban vote for all they can.
Just a quick thing on whenever you see these age differences, especially once it's pronounced as that, especially with the youngest age group, the question is always, are they going to grow out of it, or are they entering the electorate as Greens and going to stay habitually so? And I'm not sure they'll grow out of it, but I think this again is this big change between a politics that many of us in this room grew up with, where you have this loyalty that you develop early on and then you can be jolted out of, but will stick to under normal circumstances. I don't think that those young people who are voting Green in vast numbers are reliably, dependably Green. They will make decisions each election because they are not loyalists. And so it's within the Greens' scope to make the right choices and really keep increasing that vote share, but it's not at all something that I think they can, there was almost a hint in your question, they can kind of relax a bit now, because look, we've got the young people and I'm not sure they've got them as securely as all that.
I think just coming in on that, the last thing I would say, agree with all that, and I was going to say some of what Rob said, but I think the other thing is, in addition to that one of the key takeaway big figures from this election that I keep coming back to is the fact that we have 64 new MSPs in this chamber. That's the largest intake since session 1 of new MSPs. And many of the people who ended up becoming elected, particularly on the two insurgent parties, as Fraser was talking about them, are people who don't have a great deal of experience in electoral office. And certainly during the campaign, we're saying some quite maximalist, voicing support for quite maximalist positions. And you can imagine if they start moving away from those, what the electorate who voted for them when they were voicing those maximalist positions, what is that electorate going to do? And I think that sort of builds on a layer on what Rob was saying, sort of trying to figure out how the MSPs navigate that space, as well as the voters, is going to be something interesting to watch as we start building our next Scottish opinion monitoring surveys, which Rob said that we started doing already today. So yeah, the great joy of running election surveys as we do is that now I made the joke, it's like Elf, the movie Elf, where Santa comes out and says, right, we just delivered Christmas. That was great. What we're going to do, we're going to start getting ready for the next Christmas. And they go back to work again. So we're putting together the next June survey that we'll be going into the field with, trying to figure out how we sort of respond to what's happened in this election. Any last observations from any of my colleagues? No, then I'm going to.
One wee thing. The question, there's something to think about in terms of the cohort in age and life cycle effects here. So the kind of old received wisdom was that as people got older, they moderated and turned more right wing. That has, at least for like my cohort, the sort of core millennial group, not really happened. And that is I think, to a large extent, a function of the kind of political economy in Britain has just not given the bulk of that group the sort of markers of adulthood that kind of our parents' generation would have had. And as long as that is not fixed, I think you're going to see younger groups. And I mean, Chris was very generous in describing me as bringing some sort of comparative youthful vigor, and I think comparative is the operative word there.
Right.
Because when we talk about younger people are more in favour of independence, it's working age people. If you had an independence referendum among people under 65, it would win fairly convincingly, and that kind of hasn't shifted either. So I think actually it's a political problem to solve. It's within the gift of the mainstream parties, right? They can sort of create more opportunities and build more houses and get those markers of adulthood for younger people moving again, or they can't, and they might well suffer the consequences.
On that happy note, just to say, if you haven't done it, there's our resurvey that Elsa has put together for us. And the last thing, just to note before I let you go, is if you happen to know anybody in Oban, Ullapool, or Inverness, and you think that they might be interested in attending one of our lectures, Elsa and I are hitting the road next week. We're taking the SES on the road. We're actually going to get out of the Central Belt. Imagine that. And go to Oban and Ullapool and Inverness. So if you know of anybody, send them the links to our roadshow. And with that, thank you both. Well, thank all three of you very much. And thank you for coming out. Thank you.